well, you might be forgiven today for feeling just a little bit of schadenfreude about Jacob, that little feeling of joy that you get at somebody else's comeuppance. The deceiver has been deceived. The con artist has been beaten at his own game. And his tricky uncle Lavan gets the better of him in a contest that, if you've been listening carefully, might remind you more than a little of how Jacob tricked his own father. On his deathbed, the blind old Isaac mistakes the younger brother for the older. In the darkness of the marriage tent, Jacob mistakes the older sister for the younger. Well, let's not think too much about how likely that sounds, but you get the point. Today, Jacob is outmanoeuvred, but actually not for long, because in the very next chapter, which I'm sorry you're going to have to read for yourselves at home during the week because it's not given to us in the lectionary. In the very next chapter, Jacob is going to get the better of Uncle Lavan in a sneaky bet that reveals Jacob's superior knowledge of animal breeding and recessive genes. Cleaning up big time at the expense of his uncle, Jacob is going to become rich and powerful, and even the trickery that sees him bonded to Lavan for 14 years instead of 7 is going to pay off big time for Jacob, who finally gets to put the Abrahamic dynasty on the map with 12 sons. Well, as you might have heard me remark before, the Jacob cycle of stories is a morality tale with a twist. Because you're never quite sure whose version of morality you're supposed to be agreeing with, whose side you are supposed to be on. It's one of these stories that refuses to tie up the loose ends and leaves you trying to work it out for yourself. Can anything good come from behaviour that is morally suspect? Well, listen to some of Jesus' stories for today and work it out for yourself. This is how God's kingdom happens, Jesus tells us. It's like a man who finds a hidden treasure in a field that belongs to someone else. What sort of treasure, we might ask, and what's he doing there anyway if the field doesn't belong to him? I don't know, says Jesus. Maybe he's working there. Maybe it's old coins, like maybe someone buried them there when there were foreign armies around. Anyway, so the man who finds them doesn't tell anybody. He just covers them back up again and he goes away and buys the field. This is what the kingdom of heaven's like? Seeing something you want and gaining it by deceit? We've got a word for this, that sort of thing these days. We call it insider trading, don't we? We send people to jail for behaving like this. So the kingdom of God is like being sneaky and dishonest? Or maybe the story is meant to be an example of what God's kingdom isn't. Or maybe the whole point of the story is that God's blessings aren't blessings at all if they're hoarded and covered up. That God's blessings, wherever we find them, need to be opened up for everyone to share. And for sure, the story informs us, doesn't it, that God's kingdom is a treasure, and that finding this treasure, we realise that it's the centre of our lives. It tells us that God's kingdom is a wild card. And when it breaks in on our world, everything that we thought was fixed and settled is disrupted. But if God's kingdom is about inclusiveness and forgiveness and radical hospitality, where does that leave us when we unexpectedly stumble over God's blessings in our lives? Are they just for us, our treasure, or are they for sharing? So Jesus says, okay, forget that one for now. I'll give you another example. I've got lots of stories. God's kingdom is like a farmer who goes out and deliberately plants mustard seed in his field, and it grows up rampant. This is wild mustard, considered a pest actually in ancient times. Yes, it was flavoursome, and There's even some evidence that they thought it was good for the health, but it was prohibited by the religious authorities in the Talmud. You were prohibited from sowing it in your field because once planted, it takes over and it spreads and it's impossible to get rid of. I guess to give the story a more suburban context. God's kingdom is like someone who goes out the back and plants dandelions in the lawn. And they spring up healthy and strong, and the snails come and have a field day. Oh, we say. We don't get it. God's kingdom's like a weed. I will try this one, says Jesus. God's kingdom is like a woman making bread. She starts with 3 kilograms of flour and she mixes in just a pinch of yeast, and it works its way through the whole lump of dough. We're pretty sure we get this one. This one's easy. Just a little bit of God's grace or God's forgiveness or whatever turns a whole big lump of uselessness into a nice big fluffy loaf of bread. Small turns into big. We think that the kingdom of God is powerless. You think it's so small it doesn't have any effect, but actually it works its way through everything and transforms it. God's grace is transformational when you catch a glimpse of it. When, just for a moment, you see some love in a situation that's loveless. When just for a moment you catch a glimpse of hope in a situation that you thought was hopeless. And you recognise that as signs that God's kingdom is breaking in. Then just watch. Because something that you thought was set in concrete is about to get broken open and transformed into what God always intended it to be like. We're half right. We're a bit right. But I wonder, could Jesus also be telling us that it's about the mess? That God's kingdom is about what we would generally think of as disorder? Why else would Jesus be telling us that God's kingdom is like insider trading and sharp practices? Or that God's kingdom is like planting weeds in your paddock? And then, with the seed of suspicion planted in our brains, we maybe notice that this actually is the only place in the whole of the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, where yeast seems to be getting a good rap. Everywhere else in the whole Bible, even when Jesus talks about it, yeast represents rottenness and contamination. Like the yeast of the Pharisees that Jesus talks about. And that was code for hypocrisy, wasn't it? Remember, this is way back before the days of freeze-dried Tandoori yeast in little neat packets. The natural yeast known to the ancient world is a sort of mould that blows in on the wind through the open window and bubbles up and produces nasty smells. Bread, for Jesus' first century listeners, bread was supposed to stay good and flat. Like the bread of the Passover that reminds the Jews of how God brought them out of Egypt. You let a little bit of this messy, bubbling yeast into your good flour and it works its way through and contaminates the lot. It upsets the apple cart. You thought you knew what you were getting. Proper lavash bread, the proper kind. But in comes the wild card, something unexpected, floating in through the window, and you end up with a high-rise loaf that, actually this batch smells rather good. But it's not what you were expecting. So I just wonder if that's what Jesus is telling us here, that God's kingdom breaks in most especially where things aren't neat and tidy. That God's kingdom happens in the middle of the mess and the compromise of everyday life. Could he really be saying that the kingdom of God is like an outbreak of weeds that you can't control, and once it gets in here, it takes over? Like an infestation that you never would have planned and certainly didn't want, but that turns out to be unkillable. And it works its way in to all of your well-laid plans and changes everything in ways that you couldn't predict. Could Jesus really be telling us that God's kingdom can transform us sometimes by working against our human obsession for neatness and order and control? And that God's kingdom sometimes breaks into our lives in spite of our best efforts and when we least expect it. But that when we do, notice something new and unpredictable and wonderful that God is doing around us, it sure as heck matters what we do next. Seize the chance. Take Leah, for example. Jacob, of course, didn't want to, did he? Not for a moment. And of course, reading this story from Genesis, we do become, I hope we do, become uncomfortably aware that the standards of the Old Testament world are not the same as ours. And not just in relation to polygamy, but more especially in that none of the 4 women in today's story actually get a choice. The Bible translation that we read from in church this morning puts it, I think, rather too diplomatically. Leah, we read this morning in the reading that Sue read for us, Leah had lovely eyes. Well, actually, the Hebrew word there is rak, which means weak. This girl's short-sighted. It's 1,500 years before anyone's going to think of glasses. Jacob didn't want her. He'd fallen head over heels for Rachel, and here his wily Uncle Lavan has outsmarted him. Well, let's not feel too sorry for Jacob, the con man who's just been outsmarted at his own game. But spare a thought for Leah, destined to go through life with everything looking fuzzy. The wife of a husband who doesn't love her, and the daughter of a father who, let's face it, palmed her off as a practical joke. The patron saint of losers, or if she's not, maybe she should be. And yet, it's through Leah. It's through Leah, the unfairly treated daughter and the unloved wife. It's through Leah that God's promises and God's blessings are going to come true. Leah is going to be the mother of 10 of Jacob's sons, the great-great-grandmother of King David, and the great-great-great-great-great, give or take a few, grandmother, more or less, of Jesus. It's the wild card, isn't it? The spores of yeast have floated in through the broken window again. You see, well, at the risk of being heretical, there's actually nothing holy. There's actually nothing holy about the kingdom of God, if by holy we think we mean uncontaminated or set apart or clean and special and reserved for Sunday best. The kingdom of God, according to the scruffy storyteller wandering around the villages and the back lanes of Galilee, the kingdom of God is busy springing up right in the middle of the most suspect corners of our private lives and forcing its way up like a weed through the cracks of our failures and peccadillos and secret regrets. So tangled up with our own mixed motives and so hidden in the ordinariness of our mundane lives that we don't even see it. The kingdom of heaven is hidden because it's right there in plain view. In the last place we think of looking for it. Resistant to round up, and thank heaven for that. Unkillable as Cooch, and just as well. No respecter of boundaries, of convention, or of shallow pretences of religion. God's kingdom is unstoppable. And given that by the end of the next chapter, it will even transform Jacob's trickiness into grace, it's likely God's kingdom can transform you and me too, in ways we can't predict. Well, Jesus wants to know, did you understand? Oh, we say, Yes? Amen.